Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to speak today. Ruth and I will be talking about the question, who is your neighbor? Or who is our neighbor? A bit of background from me. I've worked in the homelessness and housing sector for about 10 years now, mostly in frontline work, but more recently, currently at the region of Waterloo, working more at a policy level. So who is our neighbor? In many ways, I think we cannot fully understand our neighbors until we understand ourselves and what we bring to those interactions, how we feel, and the automatic thoughts we have when we interact with the other. It is for this reason I want us to focus on ourselves. I'm going to invite you to do some work today. And in this exercise, I will borrow from the somatic therapy tradition, which encourage us to connect with our mind, our body, our sensations, and our experiences. Become more in tune with how these four areas interplay with one another. So please engage as much as you feel comfortable. We know that homelessness is present and growing in our region. It has been here for a long time, but is more in your face than it has ever been, especially in our downtown cores. There are encampments, open substance use, increased behavioral concerns, and an ever-growing housing crisis that touches all aspects of our society. It is becoming harder to ignore. It is even touching on settlement work that hasn't in years past. But a question is what often is not asked is, how is it affecting you as our region is changing and as we see our neighbors openly suffering? We are all impacted by this crisis. What are our thoughts, our emotions, our body sensations come up when we see it? I ask you to not judge yourself, do not rationalize, or jump to problem solving right away. I just ask you to feel, whatever that feeling is. So on your way to church today, you may have come down Weber, you may have crossed Victoria, and you might have saw the encampment on the corner, or maybe another encampment in our region that you passed by. What were the thoughts you first have when you see that? What were the emotions that come up? How did it feel in your body? Was it numbness, because we see it every day? Was it anger? Was it sadness? What was that feeling? You're walking downtown Kitchener, going out for dinner, or maybe going to pick up your wine at the LCBO. You turn a corner and you notice an individual prepping their substance of choice. What are your thoughts in that moment? What are your emotions? What are your sensations? Finally, maybe you're walking down the Iron Horse, you kind of inferred that, or maybe biking. You see someone talking into the void. Might be angry language, might be chaotic language. What are you feeling? Is it fear? Is it anger? Is it numbness? Is your body clenching? All these are valid experiences. Please do not judge yourself by what you feel. It is all real and relevant. We don't control these immediate feelings, nor I think it's helpful to suppress them. I ask you just to sit with them. So what now? Well, as any good pastor's son would say, let's turn to the gospel. I want to talk about the interaction Jesus has with the unnamed woman, but first, the context is important. What's really interesting about this passage, and I enjoy to go back at it, is actually most Galilean and Judean Jews at the time would not go through Samaria. They would cross the Jordan to go to the I guess it would be the west bank of the Jordan, and then have to cross the Jordan again because they didn't want to go through the territory of Samaria. They've been at conflict with one another for about 1,000 years. But if you look at the Greek, it talks about having to go. And they just said not in a practical way, there's other routes, even though they were longer. It was a body, it was a guttural way that I like to interpret it, that Jesus had to go. But what about the disciples here? What are they feeling? Jesus takes them through this territory as their leader and then sends them off to go get food. What are they feeling? These are different people than they know. They're actually at conflict with one another. What are they feeling? And it's actually just after the passage we read today, when the disciples came back, the writer records this. He says, then the disciples returned, and they were surprised to see Jesus talking to the woman. But no one asked, "What do you want? Why are you talking to her?" And what I find funny is the disciples didn't say it, but clearly they were thinking it. The writer recorded it. They're like, what's going on here? So they were feeling some form of sensation, some form of discomfort in what their leader was doing at that time. There was a lot of tension in this situation. And I think that's an important context to know, and then to lead into this interaction Jesus has with the Samaritan woman. And I want us to think about, how do we initially interpret, especially that phrase at the very end of, because I heard a couple of people chuckling, and Craig asked me, do you really want to read this passage right at the end where he talks about having 5? I was like, yes, that's the important part of the passage. So what Jesus did, first he was speaking to the Samaritan woman. This was a radical feminist action at the time. And she was rightly taken aback at first, because she knew he was not supposed to be interacting with her to the customs of the time. But the unnamed woman was also a stigmatized member, not just in this kind of cross-cultural dialogue, but in her own society. Scholars point out that she was visiting the well at midday and alone. She seems to be avoiding interactions with others. Though despite this, Jesus chose to speak to her and reveal himself as the Messiah to her, a very dangerous thing to admit in that present time under Roman occupation, which both cultures were under. He trusted the marginalized individual and took a chance. And probably the disciples were a bit uncomfortable about that. I also want to point out this interesting interaction at the end of the passage. So verse 16 says, he told her, "Go call your husband and come back." She replies, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you have 5 husbands, and the man you are now with is not your husband. What have you just said is quite true." At first, it may seem like Jesus was calling her out or judging the unnamed woman for having 5 husbands and not currently being with her husband. But I think that's a misinterpretation. Read it very closely. Jesus never calls her to repent of her actions or states a sin has occurred. And I think we all know Jesus doesn't have any issue saying that in other passages. Like, "Get behind me, Satan," or something in that fun way. So we as the reader are inferring Jesus was rebuking her. We are the ones stigmatizing her and assuming she was in the wrong. What if her 5 husbands had passed away or died? Or they divorced her because she could not give birth? What if the man she's living with is a relative who has to take care of her because no man wants to marry or support her, a necessary economic reality at the time? We don't know, but we assumed. It is in this interpretation, Jesus' statement to her is more of an invitation to admit the pain in her past, to lay down the shame she has experienced at the feet of Jesus. I think this is supported by her actions, because after the conversation, she is both excited and amazed he knows her past and is still talking to her. It's almost like she wants her story to be told. She didn't have to be ashamed of it anymore. She's no longer bound by shame, and she can announce that to the community. Am I stretching this interpretation? Maybe. But I think the writer purposely left this interaction unclear, wondering how the reader was going to interpret it. I think it adds to the story. So what does this story tell us today when we focus on who is our neighbors? We know the street-involved community is one of, if not the most stigmatized communities in our society today. They are at the pinnacle of intersectional identities, individuals with profound mental health concerns, addictions, and struggling with profound poverty, experiencing trauma, and perpetrators and victims of violence. But they are our neighbors. Do I have all the answers today? No. By working in this field for 10 years, I feel like sometimes I have less answers than more. But I know stigma needs to be named. I encourage you to check in with yourself. Check in with your thoughts. Check in with your emotions. Check in with your body sensations. None of these experiences and feelings are wrong, but they will come up in community conversations about homelessness in our region. In this process, ask yourself, what assumptions or judgments are we making that impact how we interact with the street-involved community and the organizations that support this community? Let's find the wells in our lives to listen without judgment, where stories can be told in truth. Thank you.